My name is Jennifer Neptune. I'm Penobscot from Indian Island. I'm a basket maker, a beadworker, and a Maine guide. I make baskets out of brown ash and sweetgrass. Sweetgrass grows in the salt marshes along the coast, and it's very fragrant, smells really good. I always say that basket makers have the best smelling houses because the ash smells good, the sweetgrass smells good. We use it straight and we use it braided. We use it a couple of different ways. And I brought an example of some braid. There are women that just specialize in braiding the grass, and they'll braid it like 100 yards at a time and then either trade or sell it to the women who make the baskets. And it's really special. It takes a long time to process and pick and braid. We pick it in the summer months. There's a couple of months when it's good to pick it along the coast, and then we store it up and braid it through the winter. And I have an example of a basket that's made with both braided grass and the straight sweetgrass. So this is the bottom of a sweetgrass flat basket, so it will have a cover that looks pretty much the same as the bottom. And in the center here you can see the straight grass that's woven in to the center, and it's almost like it's almost like weaving with thread because it's so thin, and it takes a long time to just keep weaving it around and around. And then as it comes out further, you can see how it kind of transitions into the braided sweetgrass that's done along the bottom and along the sides. And a lot of the time in that is, braiding it before you start to weave with it. So this basket is an old style. They were really popular in the 1800s and early 1900s, and women made all different sizes of these, and they were used a lot as sewing baskets. So people would store their all their little sewing things in there, and they were nice because you could tuck it under your arm and carry it with you if you wanted to go visit a friend or take it outside to work on your sewing. And not a lot of people do these anymore just because it's so labor intensive with the straight grass and the braided grass. I do a lot of miniature baskets, and here's a little teeny tiny basket this will either end up with a handle as just a little miniature basket, and sometimes I do these as little pin cushions that can go inside like a sweetgrass flat. So some of the older styles are pin cushions, needle holders, scissor holders that go over the pointy part of scissors. There were whole sewing kits that went with the sweetgrass flats and the open sewing baskets to store all your little odds and ends of sewing. Thimble holders. And this basket was woven on an antique block that I have, so just so you can see kind of the shape. Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, and Maliseet weavers weave around molds or blocks that give it the shape. So when I made that basket, I made it on this block. And the blocks come in different shapes and sizes. So this one is another old one, and this shape would be used for an acorn basket or a strawberry basket. And then for a miniature version, this is a real acorn that I weave around to make a life-size acorn basket. And I also do little strawberry baskets on this block. The blocks are kind of ingenious how they were made. There are ones that we call puzzle molds or puzzle blocks, and they come apart. So this is a sea urchin mold, and you can see how it curves around. So when you weave your basket around the side, you wouldn't be able to take the block out of the inside of the basket unless it came apart, so you could do that. So when you're done, when I'm done weaving around to there, then I'll pull out the middle, and then the pieces will come out of the basket and it will all come apart. So I can remove it after I'm done weaving. And here's some examples of baskets that were woven on a similar block that you can take apart, because they come in at the sides. And this is a pineapple basket, and this was woven on a barrel block. So again, those come in different sizes, and this is a medium-sized one. The ash has to be really, really good to make a basket like this, to do the points. It needs to be at least double split, and sometimes split even more, you know, triple split, to get it thin enough. So it has to be almost like paper to make those points, and you know, for the leaves on the top. As time goes on, ash is going to get more difficult to obtain, and the special ash that you can split down to be able to do work like this is going to be harder to get. So emerald ash borer is an invasive beetle that has made its appearance in Maine in the past couple of years. It's a real problem for us. As basket makers, the only tree and the only material that we use to make our baskets, like our fancy baskets and pack baskets, is brown ash. It's also called black ash. And it's the favorite tree of the emerald ash borer, which lays its eggs underneath the bark, and the larvae lives underneath, and pretty much girdles the tree, and I'll show you an example of that. So we've worked really, really hard, the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance, and you know, basket makers in all our communities have worked really hard to ensure that this tradition survives. And you know, we've taught a lot of apprentices and done a lot of workshops to make sure that this tradition stays strong. And when we started in the early 90s, you know, we never foresaw that it would be a little tiny beetle that would be the real threat to us. So in this little vial, there's an adult emerald ash borer beetle. And these ordinarily live in Asia, northern Asia, so northern China, Mongolia, Korea, that area. And they prey on ash trees. They use it as a host tree for their larvae. And it came over here in the early 2000s, we think, on probably shipping pallets. It was first found in Michigan. And the problem is, when they lay their eggs, the larvae will live underneath the bark, and it's a little, you know, it looks like a little worm when it's in the larval stage. And what it does is it eats that sap layer that's underneath the bark, and it ends up girdling the tree and eventually killing it. So if we take this off, you can see under the bark and along the outside of the wood there, the S-shape grooves that it's made, and that's the larvae as it moves and eats. And after about 5 years or so, it ends up girdling the tree completely and killing the tree. And one of the problems is it's usually in a location for 5 or so years before the trees start to die and people notice. So here in Maine, there's been a big effort to do early identification and stay right on top of it. We were lucky to hear about it coming in the, you know, the early 2000s. Weavers from Michigan warned us about the beetle and that it was killing all their trees that they also make baskets with. And they gave us a heads up on that. So the University of Maine, the Maine Forest Service, the USDA, all combined forces to prepare for its eventual arrival. The sad part about emerald ash borer is that it's moving from people. So on its own, it can only fly a very short amount of, you know, area. If it was just moving on its own, it would probably still be around the Great Lakes. But what happens is people move firewood, mostly unintentionally, not knowing that it's infected, that the larvae are underneath the bark where they can't see it. And they'll move wood to another state or, you know, within a state, and that keeps spreading the beetle further and further. So it's here in Maine earlier than we expected. We knew we couldn't hold it off forever, but still it was a shock when it was finally discovered here. And the sad part about it is that all of the new discoveries of it, so just recently it was found in 7 other Maine communities. You know, all of that is from people moving firewood. And at this point in time, like, everybody should know better than that. There's been a big push to educate people all across the country that moving firewood is moving this pest and moving other invasive species. We live in the most forested state on the East Coast, and there's no reason why, if you're camping or you're going to a camp or going to a second home, that you can't buy firewood closer to where you're going. And as a Maine guide, I can tell you, if you're going out into the Maine woods to do some, you know, backcountry camping, I have never been any place where you couldn't find down trees to build your fire with. So there's really no excuse for moving this wood and infecting other places with it. This impacts us and, you know, our thousands of year-old tradition. We may in the future not be able to make baskets anymore if all the trees are gone. But also it impacts, you know, people who play baseball. The baseball bats are made out of ash. It impacts people who like to snowshoe with traditional style snowshoes. That rim is made out of ash. Wood canvas canoes a lot of times use ash. Paddles, you know, some of the best canoe paddles are made out of ash. It has qualities that allow it to be strong but also have flexibility, and there aren't other trees that do that. So even if you don't care about baskets, you should care about those things and the environment. So we've had a lot of drought in Maine this year, and these trees grow in wetlands. They grow along river banks and streams. and they're an important part of the ecosystem and the water tables. So their loss will also be a huge impact on the environment. If you don't care about the environment, then I'd ask you to care about your neighborhood and your town and your community. After elm trees started dying of Dutch elm disease and had to be removed, a lot of communities replanted city trees along the streets with ash trees. And I've been to Michigan, I've been to the Great Lakes, and I've seen how devastating it is in cities and along streets when all those trees have to be removed because they're infected with EAB. It costs a lot of money, but also the emotional impact of living on a street that no longer has trees is really sad to see. So as someone who cares about traditions and the environment and, you know, also people's happiness, I'm just asking everyone to please be extra careful and not move firewood from anywhere. Let's keep it located where it is and try to keep it in check. So I know Gabriel Frey talked a lot about utility baskets, and so I just want to share some information about fancy baskets. Baskets tend to fall in two categories: utility baskets, which are packed baskets, carrying baskets, harvesting baskets, and what we call fancy baskets, which are sometimes smaller, they use finer weave of ash, fancy designs in them. So for example, the pineapple, this is called a Porcupine Weave, and that's a fancy basket weave. They're functional, like you can use them usually, like you could use this for storage, but mostly they're decorative. That this is meant to be decorative and put on a shelf, and maybe you put special things in it. Other fancy baskets are small or miniature. Sometimes they're useful. A sweetgrass flat is considered a fancy basket. Fancy baskets, along with utility baskets too, served a really important purpose in all of our communities in that they're useful, but also they helped Wabanaki families and communities survive a hard transition from hunting, gathering, fishing, being able to survive like that, to, you know, when the whole world changed and settlers came and they changed the landscape, the rivers. By damming them, the fish could no longer get to Indian Island, where I'm from, so salmon fishing was out in Old Town once there was a dam there, in the amounts that could sustain a community. As farming and logging changed the landscape, it changed ways that we could harvest deer and moose and even caribou back in the day. So there had to be another way to survive, and our traditions of basket making and carving and a lot of those artistic and functional traditions allowed us to trade for food or sell them for cash. And we were really fortunate here in Maine that in the Victorian times, wealthy people wanted to get out of the cities in the summer and get to someplace beautiful where there was fresh air, and they came to Maine along the coast. And in our traditional movement on the land, that's also where Penobscot and Passamaquoddy people were going in the summer. So we were going there to fish, to seal, to get bird eggs, to pick sweetgrass, to harvest clams and do all those summer things. But then all these wealthy summer people started showing up, and it just worked out beautifully for us that we could make baskets that appealed to them that they would purchase from us. So basket making became a way to survive. It became a way to continue a traditional lifestyle of movement on the landscape. It allowed us to go to the ocean in the summer where we wanted to be anyway. So it worked out really well. And in the late 1800s, when tourism in Maine started to boom, and Bar Harbor and Kennebunkport and all these summer, what we think of as summer towns, you know, sprung up, people would come to our little villages on the coast and visit our tents and buy baskets from our ancestors. And so fancy basket styles really took off and took a life of their own during that time, and got more and more fancy and more elaborate, and to appeal to that Victorian taste of the time. And so baskets were made for every conceivable reason that you can think of. So to hang on walls, to hold watches, to hold little cups that you could travel with, sewing baskets, thimble baskets, baskets to hold women's hair, to hold collar stays. All kinds of different amazing styles of baskets came out of that time, and there's still styles that we make today. So emerald ash borer has made a lot of us kind of look even further back into our traditions and to look for other materials that our ancestors made baskets from. So if there does come a time where we can't make ash baskets anymore, what are the other materials that our ancestors used? So the inner bark of cedar is one, and basswood is another important one. So in our language, the word for the basswood fiber and the brown ash fiber is the same word. They share the same word. And it's really unique. What you do is you use the inner bark, and it has to be prepared a certain way. It's really labor intensive, and I think that's why once we started to make baskets to sell to outsiders, that this kind of dropped off. So basswood would have been used traditionally to make hunting bags, to make rope, cordage, and to make tump lines. And tump lines were used to hook onto utility baskets, to hook onto toboggans, and they run, they're woven flat, and they run across either your chest or your head to help distribute the weight when you're carrying a heavy load, or you're carrying, pulling a toboggan, or you're portaging a canoe. Sometimes people will use a tump line to kind of help you distribute the weight better. It's really, really strong. And it comes from the inner bark, and you have to, get the bark off the tree, and then there's a couple of different ways that you have to prepare the fiber. It's not like you can just peel it off and start using it. It either has to be put into moving water where it can break down the fibers, or boiled with wood ashes, again, to break down the fiber. When it's ready, it smells really good too. If you could smell it, it smells amazing. It will, it feels almost like fabric, and it splits apart similar to the way that ash does. So you can do fine work, or you can do heavy work depending on what you're going to make with it, but it will peel apart. It'll also break apart lengthwise like that into different strips, and then it can be rolled into cordage. It can be braided to be woven with. So the Hudson Museum has an amazing basswood bag here, a hunting bag that has, it's been braided like yards and yards and yards of braid to be able to do that. So this is something that I've been experimenting with, and you know, some other women in my community have been experimenting with to try to recreate those bags and you know, try that tradition out, see if we can revive that so we have something else to work with as well as ash, because we're not going to give up on ash.